right? What does it mean to center love in this context? What does it mean to center compassion and healing? What does it mean to question the knowledges that we use, right? So I'm listing off some of the veins right now that actually have implications for how we do our work as educators. And I just wanted to put that out there because to me, it's just a reminder of like, it feels like as an association, we're constantly ahead of the game a little bit. And that actually really excites me and gives me hope for the future, gives me hope that we can sit in the messiness, to keep moving through it, to make mistakes, to apologize, to screw up again, to apologize, to get called out, to get called in, right? To leave certain voices out, but to act with humility even in the midst of all of that. And that actually gives me lots of hope and joy.
Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your host, Keith Edwards. Today, we have a very special episode, a recording of a live panel at ACPA in Chicago discussing the 100-year history of the association and the implications on the present and the future. You'll hear from 4 past presidents of ACPA. Harold Cheatham was president in 1995-96 and was the first African-American man to be ACPA president. Susan Comavest was president in 82-83, Denny Roberts in 85-86, and Stephen John Quay was president in 2017-18. In this brilliant conversation, they inform, share, reflect, and make meaning of 100 years of ACPA history. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and online learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find details about this episode or browse our archives at studentaffairsnow.com. Today's episode is sponsored by ACPA, an independent 501c3 nonprofit association, which is sponsoring this special 13-episode series with Student Affairs Now to celebrate their 100th anniversary, boldly transforming higher education. Please enjoy this special episode.
So, Naiwa, thank you so much for welcoming me into your space to do the land acknowledgement. As I was announced, my name is Heather Kahn-Keppel, and I'm honored to be with you today. ACPA, College Student Educators International, acknowledges that the ACPA 24 convention is taking place on the traditional, unceded homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria, Kaskaskia, and many other tribes such as Miamia, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Falls. They also called this area home. This region has long been a center for Indigenous people to gather, to trade, and maintain kinship tribes. Today, one of the largest urban American Indian communities in the United States resides in Chicago. Members of this community continue to contribute to the life and to the city and to celebrate their heritage, practice traditions, and care for the land and waterways. We as an association acknowledge that we are on occupied land that was forcibly taken, and we affirm that while we cannot change history, we can work for justice. Beyond acknowledging the land and in recognition of modern and historical settler colonialism, including that perpetuated by North American institutions of higher education, ACPA actively commits to supporting higher education and decolonizing their practice and scholarship throughout our mission, values, and the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization. Naiwa, thank you.
Thank you, Heather. My name's Keith Edwards. I'll be hosting this illustrious panel. I want to say as we embark here on thinking about the 100-year history of ACPA, we're going to also try and get some of the current and maybe even some of the future, all in 60 minutes or less. It's, I think, important to acknowledge, beyond the land acknowledgement, the history of Native and Indigenous peoples and their issues in ACPA. And as you hear us speak to some of that history isn't always great. There has been some misses, there's been some erasures, there has been some harm done. There has also been some progress and some steps forward, and although that progress is far from complete, We want to sort of honor the last part of that acknowledgement about, although we can't change the history, and some of us have been a part of it, we can take responsibility for how we move forward. And I want to invite all of you, particularly those of you who will be leading the association in the future, into that responsibility as well. Into that. Yeah. Brian's coming with another one.
I don't work out, folks. This is not cute.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. And so that history is complicated, and I think we'll hear us speak a bit to that in what we get to do today. So my name's Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a speaker, author, and coach. I also host Student Affairs Now, and this will become a version of that down the road. And I get the honor of sort of hosting, orchestrating, and managing time up here this afternoon with these wonderful folks. Before we get too far into the questions, I would invite you to a brief introduction. Stephen, maybe we can start with you, and we'll see if that microphone works.
Good afternoon, everyone. Stephen John Quay. I am currently at The Ohio State University, and I served as president of ACPA from 2017 to 2018. So it's good to be with all of you this afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Harold Cheatham, retired academic dean, Clemson University, 1995-96 president of ACPA.
I'm Susan Komovish, she, her pronouns. I retired in 2012 from the University of Maryland and was president of ACPA in 1982-83.
Good afternoon. Denny Roberts, he, him, his. And I was president in 1985-86, and I like to call myself semi-retired because I can't deal with retired yet.
Well, we're glad you're semi-retired and here with us today, and some of the other things you've contributed. We've had conversations amongst ourselves, and I've learned a lot, and I'm really grateful for that. And Denny, I want to begin with you because you've really helped me understand why looking at our history is so important. So could you start us off by speaking into that?
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for inviting me and this entire panel today. And you know you're in trouble when the moderator says this is an illustrious panel. And so
Notorious?
Well, notorious works too, but thank you very much for the compliment of that. And I guess that also causes me to look out on the audience. For those of you that I can see in these bright lights, all of you practically could be on this stage. Giving this history, and that I am here is just sheer chance. And the only reason that I think I am here is because I was slightly involved with the Generativity Project as it began back in the 1980s. So I'm glad to be here, delighted. You know, and history is critical. And I was a terrible graduate student. I read all of the historical documents when I was in grad school in the 70s. And it didn't soak in. And that's really one of the reasons why I got so enthused about generativity, because generativity and understanding our history gives honor to the people that came before us. It adds to the intellectual and personal history that all of us share. And by being generative and understanding our history and adding to it, then we make it better. Student Affairs has always been imperfect, and it always will be. And we're incremental. We build on each other. And as you will hear as we go on into our discussion today, the fact of it is we were all trying to do something better. And you are all trying to do something better. And that's the beauty of this incremental generative field. And my esteemed colleague to the right, Susan, was at dinner in 1982 with Lee Knefelkamp. And that's where this idea came from. And I had the distinct honor of being one of her doctoral students in the 70s. And, you know, Lee was this just incredibly generative person, too. Anybody who ever saw her on a podium knew they were going to be blown away. They were going to cry. They were going to laugh. and they would leave the room with some thoughts to consider as they went out. That's what we hope happens with generativity. That's what we hope happens. So a couple of things about generativity, too, is that generativity comes in actually at least two forms. One is in the personal part of it, so mentoring and protégés, and then it comes in the intellectual history. And in our field of student affairs, it is crazy. And I know Paul Brown is in the audience, but I got fascinated with Paul Brown's research on 6 degrees of separation from Esther Lloyd Jones. And I thought his research was absolutely hilarious. And so I dug into it, and I started looking at all of the ACPA presidents. Where did they come from? Who mentored them? How did they get on the role, to be a part of ACPA and its history? Well, guess what? 6 degrees of separation from Esther Lloyd Jones, it isn't 6 degrees. It's more like 3 or 4. And in fact, on this stage, we have 2 in the middle. We have Susan Comavez, who was mentored by Mel Hardy, who was mentored by Esther Lloyd Jones. And we also have Harold Cheatham, who was mentored by Ann Pruitt, who was mentored by Esther Lloyd Jones. Okay? And it goes on and on. There are others of you out there right now who know that you're 2nd, 3rd, or 4th generation Esther Lloyd Jones. And isn't that amazing to be a part of a profession where you can line up your lineage right back to the people that started it and gave us these wonderful ideas and made this all possible for us. So another part of this whole thing for me is, how do we come to improve our practice? How do we push theory? How do we push research? And we do it by fighting with each other. Sometimes we agree, but sometimes we disagree, and sometimes we disagree vehemently. And a story that I just can't resist telling you is that as a graduate student in the 1970s, I was in Colorado State University. I came there as a first-generation college student, having no idea what was going on, but getting wrapped up in student activities. Well, as things emerged, I got acquainted with this guy by the name of Burns Crookston, who was one of Esther Lloyd Jones' favorite students, just by the way. And I hung out. My RA course was with Ursula Delworth, and Jim Hurst was there to help me with the smoking cessation clinic that I went to, which was awesome. Thank you, Jim. I had all these student development people on one side, but guess what happened? I went to my first conference in 1973, and the vice president for student affairs, and I will not mention his name, took me to a bar and said, oh, don't pay any attention to any of the student development stuff. Really, it's all about student services and administration. And if you don't focus on services and administration, you're really going to lose out. Well, obviously, I did not pay attention to his advice. And instead, I took a student development role, and I studied with Lee, and the rest of its history. I made the right choice. That's not to say that administration and services is not important. It is. I understand that. But there you have, in a graduate student experience, I was reading Bob Brown, I was reading the THE, I was doing all of this reading about student development, and my vice president was telling me, ignore it. That's not what's happening. So I just find that really amazing. And I find it amazing in the context of our advancing of the field almost always comes from contestation. We contest each other, we propose new ideas, and guess what? We still love each other. We know that. So that's my story about why history is important. And the history that we have is both about the people and it's about the ideas and how they evolve together.
Thank you. I love this contested. Stephen, I wonder if you could pick up on this notion of contested issues, contested histories, and the progress.
Yeah, thank you, Keith, and thank you, Denny, for setting us up really nicely this afternoon. So I do actually want to pick up with where Denny left off around this notion of like the contestation of these pieces. And so one of the things that I think has existed throughout ACPA's history, and I'm still so deeply, like I'm still emotional about the opening session last night, just being on stage with all of those past presidents, I didn't expect to be as emotional as I was in the moment. But one of the things that stood out to me as I was reflecting last night and even in preparing for this session is the ways in which controversy, disagreement, tension, contestation has always been interwoven throughout ACPA's history, right? So the reason that ACPA started was because women were not reflected, right? And so I think that's important to remember, that our founding is tied to controversy, right? And that has been interwoven throughout all of our history. And I'll talk more about the strategic imperative later on today, but I just want to mention one point here that is tied to that. Our mission around ACPA is around centering student learning. And when we try to center and think about devoting focused attention to racial justice, again, that was not met without any sort of pushback or controversy. And so just a quick story about the history of the imperative. When we originally launched the imperative, it was called the Strategic Imperative for Racial Justice. And I think that's important to name and for folks to remember that. We didn't have the and decolonization piece initially. And that, again, came through pushback, through controversy, through disagreement. And so I was present at the time, and we got a lot of feedback from our Native and Indigenous members that they didn't see themselves reflected in just racial justice, right? Because of the ways in which their identities are tied to the history around colonization, the history around like our politics in our society, right? So we went through some reflection to actually add that piece on because of pushback, right? And I will say personally, like that impacted me in the sense that, like, I'm somebody who studies racial justice, thinks about race and racism a lot. And to see that I had sort of overlooked a specific group in our association, that was hard to hear. And yet I knew that those were voices that we had to pay attention to if we wanted to keep moving forward. Just like we had to pay attention to women's voices if we wanted the association to be what it is today. So to me, I think that's an important thread around how throughout all of our history, it's not that the controversy, that's not the part that's important here. To me, the takeaway point is this question: what do we fundamentally do as people and as an association when we are met with controversy, when we are met with pushback? It's how we respond that matters. And I think throughout ACPA's history, we have tried to respond in ways that matter, even when it's messy, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's frustrating, even when it's hard, even when you want to give up, right? We keep going because that matters. And to me, that's the takeaway point is, what do you do when you receive that pushback? So I just appreciate Denny raising that, because it allows us to really understand, I think, how that controversy, that contestation, again, has been interwoven throughout our association. And I think that's one of the beauties of ACPA's history.
Yeah. A powerful connection from the history to the more near present. I love that. And I'm 4 degrees separated from Esther Lloyd Jones because Susan is one of my mentors. And so she's, I guess, 2 degrees. We'll have to figure out the degrees later. But this is a full circle moment because I was in Susan's doctoral class as a first-year doctoral student, and we had to read all of those documents, the THE and the student personnel point of view. We went to ACPA, we went to NASPA, we did all those things. I had to write papers, and I had to do presentations on it. So, Susan, you have 10 minutes.
Delights in knowing he's flipped the tables.
It's a delight. You have 10 minutes to cover the focus of a 100-year history of the association. I'd like you to track 2 themes: professional development and the focus on students.
Yeah, it's a lot of material to cover, and it seems like it should be. I remember that assignment, too, and I loved it because I asked those students to look at those documents. And here I'm ad-libbing, and I have 10 minutes. Anyway, I asked the students to look at those documents. How did they reflect their time? How were they visionary for their time? What did they omit or didn't see? So we're trying to look at them with a critical eye, too, which is what we our history shows.
Yes, and
think.
I still see those documents and think of you first and then go into it.
Then me and then them. Okay. I do. They did ask me to look. I'm going to particularly focus on the second half of the 20th century. A lot of the reformation of student affairs and the work that we do now happened in that era, and I lived during that era with the ACPA leadership role, and so it's very special and important to me too. Denny mentions Esther Lloyd Jones as such a primal force for all of us. She's in our DNA somewhere, and largely, as we all know, because, or many of us know, because of the student personnel point of view in 1937 that she and others developed to try to capture what this role was for student affairs. And that overarching philosophy is a point of view that we bring. So what came forward in that is still with us, and it undergirds just about everything ACPA has been shaped by and chosen to do, that each student's unique, that we believe in their whole development, developing their capacity to the fullest, and that the whole environment's responsible for that learning. And those themes from all that time ago still drive today's decisions, even if we're not as conscious that might have been there or be with us. So I do want to comment on both of those themes that Keith mentioned, particularly in light of the second half of that century. Let me start with professional development, and I'm going to talk at 1.5 speed here. But I want to talk about professional development and professionalism that we tried to contribute to. And there are a number of dimensions of that ACPA has evolved through. First of all, we've always been a collegial association. Everyone could vote, quote, regardless of title. That's what's in those original documents. And we've always sought ways to make that inclusion vibrant. How can we get more inclusive so there's more involvement? And every member feels like this is their association. We had regions from early on in the beginning, but in 1955, we added state divisions and then international divisions. In 1961, my mentor, Mel Hardy, was president-elect, and she and Gordon Clough developed the commission structure. And from then on, commissions started to be added around largely functional areas, so we could find communities of practice in the association. Just a year later, the standing committees were formed, and the first entity-type standing committee was on race, later changed to multicultural affairs, but it was on race, followed by one on women. So our early emphasis in establishing these entity groups made a place for people as members to talk about their identities, but also our students who have those identities and what they needed our awareness and attention to in their lived experiences. 10 years later, though, I want to say those commissions and standing committees had self-perpetuating directorate bodies. There might be 15 people on a directorate for each one, and they picked their replacements, some in a more democratic way than others, but they picked them. 10 years later, we opened up all the commissions and all the standing committees to all members. You could join the Commission on Residence Education, and then they elected their own directorate body, and people could be involved in the work of that commission. And it's important to know that was done as to be a more inclusive association for member involvement. And as Stephen has said well, it's important to then see that members have driven the development of how this association's evolved. Standing committees like the LGBT Awareness Committee came because members said we need attention ourselves and find each other and support the needs that we have as well as what our students need on campus. But that has come out of the membership through the structures that we had in place to address that. We've done elaborate reorganizations of the association, always to try to find better ways for everybody to want to be at the table. It's a big table in ACPA, and we're always trying to streamline but still give voice to that. That always doesn't work, and so a few years later, we'll reorganize again. But we're looking for ways to have voices be inclusive and be an association that could model you can do that. How can you do that, and that it's worth the hard work? So our history is dynamic with multiple ways to involve members. Another dimension of our professional development and professionalism is we've always been devoted to scholarship. We've been known as a scholarly association, and the culture of scholarship's been important in ACPA. As Heather said last night, the World War II's Personnellogram became the Journal of College Student Personnel in 1959, and a year after that, the association started the Student Personnel Monograph Series, which existed through 17 or 18 monographs over a number of years. And then various media boards were established, and ACPA has published in its history over 50 books and monographs to advance the field, often with topics that no publisher would take because it would have too small a market, but it needed to be out there in the literature, and we would give voice to what the needs were for whatever that topic was and get that out there. The Generativity Project in 1982 that Denny has alluded to that we're very fond of, there's a way to keep generatively the voices of elders and people who have contributed to our history are still with us. We established, the year I was president, the Theory and Research Board, giving grants so we could advance these knowledge bases, and then also establish senior scholars that years later established the emerging scholars as we know them in the association. Another dimension in this professional development is expanding the professionalism of members, and one of the very, very important ways that we shouldn't lose track of, read it again, is the ACPA ethics statement, first passed in 1981. A professional field has standards for itself and its members, and you and I are all obligated to those standards, and that's important that that pass along in our culture even now. We certainly have had annual conventions, institutes, addressing the needs of from new professionals to senior student affairs officers. And I remember very fondly in 1988, President Marva Stiles Hughes started a series that we call, with others, started a series called Roadshows on Diversity. And we would take things out to members in their state divisions and out to campuses that couldn't come to conventions. And how would we get the word out there with good teaching and good scholarship, bring it out to the people? We always have had institutes then building on that, including things like assessment, disability, sustainability, residential curriculum, social injustice, social justice. It's also been important to us as a key dimension that we partnered and collaborated with lots of associations. We have thought of ourselves as an umbrella associations in many ways. When Tom Greitz is here, an NACADA president and chair of Commission 1 at the same time, where we're bringing together professionals to talk across platforms, and you could get a lot out of ACPA because of that. Based on our counseling roots, in 1952, we joined with four other associations, counseling focused like we were, and formed the American Personnel and Guidance Association. We were Division I of the American Guidance Association and always struggled with that relationship, finally disaffiliating 40 years later in 1992. And so we became an independent association 40 years after having been formed the one that was our umbrella group. We also, in 1979, with other associations, formed the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Post-Secondary Education. And ACPA early presidents of Ted Miller and Phyllis Mabel were key people that served 20 years as the first two presidents of CAS, followed by ACPA President Don Creamer. So we wanted to advance standards in the whole field and advance them through CAS. And throughout our history, we've done lots of collaborative projects and papers. For example, with NASPA, the Professional Competencies Model, that's still out there and being revised even as we talk today.
You can breathe now.
Yeah. Okay, I can breathe now. Second theme, and I'll move to it very quickly, is to think about our students throughout this. Their development, their learning, their identities have always been central to us. You didn't always hear students talked about in a lot of higher ed conferences, but at ACPA, students were practically on every program title and needed to be. We were about students. Up through the 60s, the view of students was very traditional and overly traditional. You know, they were white residential students that lived on campus, and most of our programs were, most of our campuses were aligned that way. Not true of all. But boy, when I came into the field, and this was an exciting time, I'm a college graduate from Florida State in 1968, and the 60s were an exciting, activist, certainly, kind of period. We had the Civil Rights Act in the mid-60s, we had the Higher Education Act, Title IX came along. Early 70s, the voting age got lowered to 18. We had to switch to contracts in housing and not in loco parentis kinds of models. The growth of community colleges, tribal colleges, focus on disabilities with Section 504. Anyway, all this prompted a sea change. What was student affairs going to look like when our students were changing so dramatically and we needed to respond to ways of organizing to meet those very diverse needs? We had Piaget and Erickson out there, pretty traditional models from psychology. But in 1969, my first year at the University of Tennessee in residence life, this guy came out with a book that had vectors in it. And Chickering's vectors became something we glommed onto as a framework for organizing our work as well as a model for student development, followed very quickly by Lee and others' introduction of Perry's work on cognitive and intellectual development. And these bodies of knowledge meant we were doing theoretically based practices that would over time become evidence-based practices. But it certainly supported the movement towards student development theory. Therefore, in that era, in the early 70s, ACPA addressed this and says, what is the future of student affairs work? And presidents at that time, Harold Grant and Ted Miller, helped give leadership to the Tomorrow's Higher Education Project called THE, not to mean the only one, but let's look at Tomorrow's Higher Education. Bob's monograph on Return to the Academy was a wonderful way to say we should have a curriculum across the university. Faculty and administrators are responsible for students' learning and development. And then the Future of Student Affairs book that Ted Miller and Judy Prince did that actually introduced a new model for student development and the concept of student development as a framing device. And they described it as we can master increasingly complex developmental tasks, achieve self-direction, and become interdependent, not independent, but interdependent. So a good definition. Now, ACPA was all in. In 1988, we changed the journal name to Journal of College Student Development. And it was not without controversy. In 1994, Paul Bloland and Lou Stamatakos did a very provocative little reform in Student Affairs book, saying student development was an ill-conceived notion, means too many things to too many different people. And the Journal, with Carney Strange and other people's wonderful articles, fired back and said, this is why it's good, and here's the propositions that we operate from. So we were happy to defend that model and what it meant in our field. The 80s was an era of reform reports. In the 1980s, there was a reform report every 6 weeks that came out of some association, some legitimate group, not to even mention Bloom and all those terrible people that wrote their own books that blasted higher education. But there was a reform report that were pretty good, that always said we need to return to teaching, and they always looked at the experience of minoritized students like black men in mathematics. You know, there would be topics that needed some kind of attention. By the 90s, we were actually coming forward with new models that tried to address those reports, and from teaching to learning. And I have to give a lot of credit to President Charles Schroeder, along with our friend George Koo and others, who then developed the student learning imperative that ACPA gave leadership to in the field that said, indeed, academic learning and student development are inextricably intertwined. You can't separate learning and development. They are part of the same thing, and it's important that we advance them as partners in the student's brain and heart in how they learn and how they develop. Lots of collaborative projects then took on this same theme. We partnered with NASPA on principles of good practice, and good practices included active learning, building supportive and inclusive communities. We partnered with NASPA again and AAHE on powerful partnerships, a shared responsibility of learning that hit the whole environment kind of piece of that a lot. And then a whole group of us past presidents with NASPA, Nancy Evans and me and Susan Salvador and some other colleagues were on Learning Reconsidered, which got us to relook at all of that learning. And there's some good work in that on learning outcomes and where those outcomes can be developed across the environment, and that we need to be assessing those outcomes. So Learning Reconsidered, too, said, so how do we apply this in practice? And Jeannie Steffes' leadership with 4 other associations got us to look at the assessment of those outcomes. So back to the student personnel point of view, we've involved ourselves a lot. We have learned a lot about our students. We believe every student's unique, but we've also know that individual identities aren't sufficient. We have moved ourselves into looking at commitments to intersectionality, to equality, to social justice, and leading to the current strategic imperative that we face, and knew we had a lot more to do going into the 21st century. So that's like 50 years of higher education.
Now, you all can take a breath, too. Have you ever seen The Matrix? When they just plug that thing in the back of your head? That's 100 years of history of ACPA from Susan Komovis. Well done. Harold?
Thank you, Susan.
Harold, we would like you to speak, and if you could hold the microphone close, that'd be
all
great.
right.
We would like you to speak, having heard all of that history. and an important bridge in that history. What bridges do you see emerging from that?
My task, as I understood it, was to talk about the 60s to now. And I want to start that by talking about how I became a member and ultimately the president of the association. Never a goal of mine. As a practicing professional without a doctorate, I became a graduate assistant of Ann Pruitt, who was the secretary of ACPA. And I knew then that there were a couple of professional organizations, but I was already selected as the guy who carried the Wallensack reel-to-reel tape recorder to the executive council or committees meetings and transcribed the minutes and notes for the secretary of the association. I joined in 1970, and somewhere around 1990s, I found myself being petitioned to accept nomination to president. And then I found myself as president, and I looked around to colleagues, many of whom Susan has mentioned, and said, what do I do as president? And I shall never forget, Don Kramer said, steer. The rest of us will tell you when you're off track. And so into that job description, I pitched myself. We had recently finished one of the several, as I like to term them, courtships with our fellow organizations. And it always has interested me, not amazed, but interested me, how useful those have become with us to define our path and to refine who we are and what we are doing. As I recall, early in my time in the association, we had that courtship with women deans, NODAC. And after lots of scramble and reports and subcommittee reports, as I recall, NODAC said it was an interesting courtship, interesting date time, but it was not in the best interest of NODAC to affiliate with another association. So out of that, we picked up the pieces and went on to what we were doing. Susan has mentioned the focus on scholarship, and to me that is an important point because I've always experienced the tension, the creative tension in that focus, and that's how we got to have About Campus. About the time that I was coming into the presidency, there was a lot of tension in the association that we had gotten, in fact, a little too scholarly, and that the needs of practitioners were not being observed and focused on as they ought to be. And out of that emerged the publication of the About Campus, which was aimed at ensuring that we included and focused on the needs of the practitioner wing or membership. What is valuable to me as a member of the association is that there's always been this focus on fellowship, mutual support, interdependence and collaboration, and respect for emerging opinions, and the ability in this association for people to be called up short on missteps or out of step things that they have done, and to be lovingly counseled and lovingly counseled and embraced and brought into line, redefining ourselves each time as we have gone. Out of those things became the strong association that we experience today. The disaffiliation from APGA in the early 90s was pretty much culminated in the establishment of the first national office in D.C. The petition that we had for admission to acceptance into the National Higher Ed Secretariat and the hiring of the first executive director. I enjoyed a presidency that I was never alone. In fact, I personally don't consider myself to have been the president of ACPA because we functioned very much as a panel. I see Barbara Anderson shaking her head. She immediately preceded me as president, and the first strategic plan was born on Barbara's kitchen table in her Atlanta home, where we gathered a number of times as we put that together, each one bringing pieces to the discussion. Finally, I wanted to focus on the future. And in my presidential address in 1996, making our way was the objective. And I finished that piece by proclaiming that there was a bright green sign that marked ACPA's horizon. And here we are some 30 years later, and I still see the same bright green sign marking our horizon. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Susan, I wonder, you shared a lot of information, and Harold's sort of bringing some themes and story. I wonder if what he's sharing conjures anything up for you.
I think there must be more stories. I think the establishing of a separate, it meant we were around then, but I wasn't involved in the leadership then, but establishing our own separate association with its own identity meant we had to go back and do a whole lot of things from scratch that were done for us by APGA prior to that. And I felt like we were adolescents again somehow as an organization. A lot of struggling with identity and what were we going to be, and the foundation started, and but membership issue. What were some of those struggles in that disaffiliation, identity building phase of the association?
I actually don't share that perspective.
Contested, perfect, spot on.
I thought that having gone through the series of attempts to marry ourselves with other associations helped us to identify what truly were our specific objectives that needed burnishing. I didn't feel like an adolescent. I felt that we had all the pieces that we needed to, and the leadership, and that's why I think that, and maybe I take too much credit or put too much emphasis on it, but I think that the collaboration that we had as past presidents and current presidents, and no king of the hill or queen of the hill, that I just felt a great spirit of collaboration that allowed us to identify what our principles and practices were that needed burnishing.
That's a good perspective. I think one thing that we should give voice to and not just assume happens in every association is the president-elect, the president, and the past president. Those teams of people have been remarkably collaborative about advancing an agenda they agree on. And it usually isn't one person's idea or one person's agenda. There are people with visions that the others readily adopt, and so there might be an initiator of a vision. Charles did a lot of that with things like the learning imperative. But we've had remarkably compatible transitions among those threesomes in the senior leadership over the whole association.
Wonderful. Stephen, you most recently were in the past president role, and I wonder what you're hearing about some of this further distant history reminds you of your presidency and leading with the strategic imperative and some of the themes. The theme that I'm hearing is this contested and tensions. A colleague reminds me that what keeps most bridges up is actually the tension, that the tension is generative, to use Denny's term. I'm wondering what this is all evoking for you.
So yeah, thanks for the question, Keith. So there's sort of three broader themes that are really staying with me in this moment. So, and I'll just touch briefly on each of them. So one is what we've been talking about today is, again, the importance of history. Secondly is the importance of representation. And then thirdly is change, or like what change looks like. And so let me just talk about each of these again briefly. So history. So I think with this strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization, so Donna Lee was president in 2016, and so this came about through a retreat that we were having as a governing board. Much like many governing boards before us, we were taking time to really reflect on the mission, vision, and values of the association, and to what extent are we living out these values? How relevant are these values to today, right? How do we put these values into practice? Out of these conversations, we just kept sharing stories of colleagues on our campuses who were experiencing a lot of pain, trauma, violence from continued systemic racism that was happening. And these were stories upon stories that colleagues were sharing over and over at this meeting. And so out of these conversations, we decided, we're an association that says we are about student learning and moving towards that. How can we not link student learning with a focus on addressing racism, right? The two we saw as intimately linked. We can't focus on student learning if we aren't fundamentally also addressing the ways in which racism is impacting student learning, right? How are you supposed to learn as a student if you are afraid to live in your body, for example, as a Black person, right? Your learning is fundamentally impacted because of the identities in which you live in. So out of these conversations, that's where our focus to, again, devote some focused attention to racial justice and ask ourselves, what would a student learning look like if we also paired that student learning lens alongside a focus on racial justice? I mentioned how the decolonization piece came about earlier. So again, I want folks to remember that history is important to understand how this imperative came to be today. And again, like I said, it was not met without controversy, right? There was significant pushback. Does this mean that we are moving away from our mission as an association, right? How as a white person do I fit into this? Like, what does that mean for my work on a day-to-day basis? What does this look like in practice? I'm not resistant towards this, but I'm afraid I don't really have the tools to know what this means, right? There was a lot of angst around this. I mean, naturally, right? All these movements towards justice doesn't come with some uncertainty, some hesitancy. And so that's what motivated me to bring some colleagues together to craft a bold vision forward, which provided some guideposts for how we might live this out in practice. So again, the first piece here is around history. Secondly, I mentioned the importance of representation. It's no coincidence, Donna Lee, myself, Jamie Washington, we were the three presidents at the time. I was president in 2017-18. Donna Lee was past president, and then Jamie Washington was vice president. It's no coincidence that three presidents who identify as Black, right, were the ones who pushed the association towards this imperative, right? Again, representation matters. My time as ACPA president was enriching because of my relationship with both Donna and Jamie. Having folks who looked like me in those leadership roles was instrumental. It was instrumental for our membership as well, right? We often had folks, Black folks specifically, who said, seeing you makes me believe that I am part of ACPA, that if this is something that I aspire to do, it's something that I can do as well. So the importance of representation matters, right, in these leadership roles. So that's number two. And then again, I'll end with just the importance of change. So what does change look like? And I think this is what the imperative asks us to think about. I was really moved by the opening speaker last night, who demonstrated for us the ways in which story sharing the ways in which we can actually dismantle our institutions through a decolonization lens. And so often when we think of issues of racial justice, of decolonization, these are massive, big issues, big concepts. How do we exist along land that was stolen and still move towards decolonization, right? That's a massive question. How do we move towards racial justice while there's still police violence happening towards Black and brown people, right? So these are big questions. We're not gonna solve racism in my lifetime. But what I often tell folks to think about are some key questions. And the primary one here is, what can you do within your sphere of influence to make a difference? So that means if you are a faculty member, you have students who you teach on a weekly basis, that is your sphere of influence. If you're a VPSA, a Vice President for Student Affairs on campus, you have staff who are relying upon you to advocate for them, to show up for them, to support them, right? That is your sphere of influence. So if all of us focused on those spheres, we can make that change. And to me, that gives me some agency in the midst of feeling like these issues are so big that it's hard to figure out how to even make any sort of sustainable change. So to me, I think that's important, and I think that, again, is what ACPA, I think, has reminded me time and time again, that we can shift attention, we can strategize, we can focus on certain issues, all towards, again, the idea of what can I do within my circles or my spheres of influence to make it a little bit better than it was yesterday.
Thank you, Stephen. And Denny, I know you've been engaged with the strategic imperative and with Stephen on this. And what do you want to share here before we move to our concluding thoughts?
Well, what's fascinating is that I was working abroad. I was in Qatar at the time that the racial justice imperative was emerging, and I believe I attended a session that you and others facilitated when it was still just racial justice. And I was sitting there as an internationalist thinking like, this is not really working for me because racism looks very, very different in the context of another culture, specifically in the Middle East. And so I left the meeting kind of feeling left out of the picture. And to your credit, Stephen, later on you invited people to be in conversation with you about it. And so I suspended my hesitation and said, I'll try this again. Well, guess what? At that point, decolonization was starting back into the picture. And guess what? I hugely connected with it at that point, because part of the problem in international higher education is the fact that we are in a neo-colonial era now as U.S. educations go abroad. And it's dangerous. It's disrespectful. And we need to take this on, and we need to start asking questions. And so the amazing revelation was that this works for me as an internationalist. And, I think, again, to ACPA's credit, and if you've not viewed it yet, there's a very cool video that came out just last week where there are several of us talking about history and so forth. So everything that Susan didn't get to say today is in that video. It's an hour and 50 minutes long. But the video is just awesome. And Dre Dominga basically said, well, Denny, I'm not sure I buy this internationalization thing because I don't think that ACPA has any business going there. She said, we need to be more humble. She used that specific word. That is a word I love. I love humility. I love curiosity. I love people who are eager listeners. And decolonization says to me, we are deep learners, deep listeners, and people who want to understand the world from a different perspective. That is awesome. And kudos to ACPA for staying humble on that and giving us an opportunity. And I think actually there's some very cool opportunities in the future here to begin to talk about that as a part of ACPA's kind of plank to internationalization. It's really cool.
Denny, I know that affected you professionally, and you're thinking about the profession. Could you speak to how it affected you personally?
Well, I mean, why did you ask that? You know, I think that our work is about humility and listening and care. And so when that's in your face, then it's kind of like a revelatory moment. So, yeah, I better not say anything more. Stephen, go.
Yeah, so just building from there, Denny, the other thing that I think is also not lost on me in this session and today is, so the strategic imperative is 7, 8 years old at this point, almost 10 years, which is hard to believe, actually. 2017 is when we sort of fleshed out this strategic imperative. How prescient were we as an association, right, when we think of our current context? Anti-CRT, anti-DEI, right? This is happening on our campuses. University of Florida, right, firing its DIE professionals, right? This is something 7 years ago that we didn't even know what this was going to be like 7 years later. And how prescient now was the imperative 7 years ago in giving us language and something to coalesce around in pushing back against these anti-CRT, anti-DEI bills that are happening, that are threatening many of us in this room, right, in very real material ways. And that, to me, again, is a reminder about what ACPA means to me, why, even through some of the frustration, the anger, the sadness, the humility to that word that Denny brought up, the pushback, the having to own my own stuff and sit in my own guilt and shame and still find my way through it and keep moving and keep talking and not give up and wallow in that, right? Even through all of that, the reason fundamentally that we did that is because the imperative is not just fancy words, right? It's not just a bold vision forward and we have these, the veins and the principles and the centering love. Like, it's actually tools to address fundamentally what's happening on our campuses right now. One of the veins is when we embrace dialogue and suspend efficiency. Like, when we suspend efficiency and embrace dialogue, we actually spend time actively listening to people. We're not just trying to react immediately, but we have to actually understand what's happening, right? Engage in dialogue, right? What does it mean to center love in this context? What does it mean to center compassion and healing? What does it mean to question the knowledges that we use, right? So I'm listing off some of the veins right now that actually have implications for how we do our work as educators. And I just wanted to put that out there because, to me, it's just a reminder of, like, it feels like as an association we're constantly ahead of the game a little bit, and that actually really excites me and gives me hope for the future, gives me hope that we can sit in the messiness, to keep moving through it, to make mistakes, to apologize, to screw up again, to apologize, to get called out, to get called in, right? To leave certain voices out, but to act with humility even in the midst of all of that. And that actually gives me lots of hope and joy.
Could I comment again, now that I've regained my composure? Esther would be so proud of us today, and Lee would be very proud of us today. That is the coolest part of this, and it really is the generative nature of our field, that we can struggle with these ideas, we can try to figure out how to make it better, and we compare, contrast, argue, do whatever we need to do to get through it. But I believe that our values, as Susan has very clearly indicated, are very much the same. We may redefine it a bit, we may put more detail to it, but this is, it's a journey that we're all on, and I know that there are people that are sitting there today that are dreaming up the next direction, and dreaming up the next big questions that need to be addressed. But we're in a very interesting place right now, and Stephen, the attack that we are experiencing in terms of diversity and critical thinking is frightening, and we got to hold together. Got to be with each other, get each other's back.
Thank you. I want to give Susan and Harold a chance to get a very quick voice in here, as you both have been thinking about this history and this panel, and we've spent more time in conversations about this panel than we've been on this panel. Anything new emerging for you, Susan? Any new themes that you want to give voice to?
Well, I'll try to be brief. I will be brief, although I have to start off by saying I live in Florida. And the day-to-day of that is heart-wrenching. It makes me anxious, tension all the time. Quality professionals won't come to work maybe in the state now because of what the lived experience would be. It makes me think of all of us. If your state's not experiencing that personally, don't just gloss over it and think it doesn't affect the field or all of us in this profession. And look for new allies on campus. Sociology departments need allies because, as in the state of Florida, sociology can no longer be counted as meet a general education requirement because it's too woke. Sociology is too woke, for the state of Florida. So look for allies that also need to join with us as we do them in support of these values behind why we do what we do. The other is to remember some of our history, and I would bring up women here. I remember the era of being proudly, certainly a feminist, and having friends say, well, I believe in this, 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 and this, but I'm not a feminist. Well, you certainly are. That's what that sounded like to me. So I think we've got to look for new languaging. We need to look for new framing or new approaches that languaging things becomes very important. The languaging we're now using is distancing people from us that might even say they believe some of the same things, but they're not going with that language. So how can the association help us relanguage some of these important objectives?
And Harold, it's been about 20 years since you've been at an ACPA convention, is that right? Probably. Yeah. What, in your experience here this week, what strikes you as remaining the same and evergreen about this association as you've experienced being here?
That we're doing everything all at once. Actually, I personally and professionally am comforted by the work that I have seen. These things that we're struggling with on the national scene, we've been struggling with them as an association, and we have evolved ways to make our way through the complexity. We actually have documents, and we've spoken to them that have emerged in the 100 years of ACPA, and so the hustle and bustle that has gone on with the association, with the meetings, have been comforting to me. That fruition, this is what fruition feels like to me.
Beautiful. If you haven't looked this up on the PDF, be sure to. If you haven't ordered a copy, to flip through. It is beautiful. It is stunning. It includes a lot of what was covered here and a lot more. I'm grateful for all of you for being here, for the folks who have worked for decades on generativity and the history of the association, so we have it. I'm grateful for the folks who are telling these stories. I'm specifically grateful for the four of you and how you have joined in community with each other to agree, to contest, to disagree, and tell the story of the association's history and why it is important in the current moment and for the future. Join me in thanking them, please.
Thanks to our sponsor of today's episode, ACPA. ACPA, College Student Educators International, celebrating its 100th anniversary, is boldly transforming higher education by creating and sharing influential scholarship, shaping critically reflexive praxis, and advocating for equitable and inclusive learning environments. ACPA aspires to be higher education's and student affairs' most inclusive and community-driven association by leading our profession in centering social justice, racial justice, and decolonization as defining concepts of our time and the foreseeable future. Visit myacpa.org or connect with them on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to learn more about ACPA. A huge shout out to Nat Ambrosi, our producer, who did all the behind-the-scenes work to make this look and sound good. And thanks to ACPA for recording this conversation and sharing it with all of you. We love the support of these important conversations from our community. That's you. You can help us reach more folks by subscribing to the podcast on YouTube and our weekly newsletter that announces each new episode and more. If you're so inclined, you can leave us a 5-star review to help even more folks benefit from these conversations. I'm Keith Edwards. Thanks to ACPA and these fabulous guests. It was a treat to host and moderate this conversation. I'm glad we were able to share it with all of you. To all of you watching and listening, make it a great week. Thanks all.